Italian warships. Mediterranean Sea. 1943. Late night just before dawn. The harbor was supposed to be the safest place in the sea. Water lay calm inside the breakwaters, shielded from open swells and enemy approach. Anchored ships sat motionless, their silhouettes dark against the faint glow of shore lights. Engines were cold, crews rotated watches. The night felt contained, controlled by stone, steel, and routine. This was not a fleet at sea. This was a fleet at rest. Italian warships lay anchored close together, bows aligned, mooring lines taut. The spacing was tight by necessity. Harbors were not built for maneuvering, they were built for holding. Inside them, ships surrendered mobility in exchange for protection. That trade-off had always been accepted. On deck, the mood reflected it. Guns were manned lightly, ammunition was secured. Fire control systems were not fully energized. There was no expectation of immediate action. If danger came, it was assumed there would be warning, minutes at least, to raise steam, cast off lines, bring weapons online. Harbors had always offered time. That belief shaped everything. Crews trusted stone walls and narrow approaches to slow any threat. Command assumed that anchored ships could transition from rest to readiness if needed. Even surprise was expected to arrive with distance, enough space to react. But on this night, distance did not exist. What the Italian crews did not realize was that the engagement would not unfold across open water. It would erupt at close range, inside the harbor's own geometry. The walls meant to protect them would become boundaries they could not escape. There were no alarms yet. No flares. No warning shots. No signal that the harbor itself was about to turn hostile. Then the first shells landed. They did not arrive gradually. They arrived fully committed, slamming into anchored ships that could neither turn nor accelerate. Explosions ripped across decks where men had been standing moments earlier. Fire leapt instantly, unchecked by movement or spacing. The shock was absolute. Anchored ships cannot evade. They cannot spread out. They cannot reorient quickly. The opening salvos struck vessels locked into place, forcing crews to absorb damage without any option to maneuver away from it. Mooring lines held ships steady as flames climbed superstructures. Commands were shouted, but movement was impossible. Engines were not ready. Steam was not up. Casting off under fire took time the fleet did not have. Guns began to move, but arcs were restricted by neighboring ships and harbor walls. The harbor had become a cage. Smoke filled the confined space rapidly, blinding crews and trapping heat. Fires reflected off stone and steel, multiplying confusion. Each ship's emergency became every ship's problem. Within minutes, the geometry of the harbor dictated the outcome. Ships could not separate. They could not retreat. They could not regroup. They could only endure. 6 minutes. That was all it took. 7 Italian warships would be lost before the situation could even be understood, not because they were outgunned at sea, but because they had been caught where movement was impossible. The battle would not be remembered for maneuver or tactics. It would be remembered for stillness. Because the harbor that promised safety removed the one thing warships need to survive: space. And once space was gone, the opening salvos decided everything. Harbors are designed to remove uncertainty. Stone walls narrow approaches, breakwaters blunt waves, fixed anchorages impose order on steel hulls that otherwise roam freely. In peacetime and transit, this geometry feels reassuring. In war, it can become unforgiving. Inside the harbor, Italian warships were arranged for efficiency, not combat. Berths were assigned to maximize space usage, reduce wake damage, and simplify logistics. Ships lay bow to stern in orderly rows, close enough to share services and maintain watch, far too close to maneuver independently. That closeness mattered. At anchor, a warship surrenders the very advantages that define it at sea: speed becomes irrelevant, turning radius disappears. Even modest course changes require time to raise steam, slacken lines, coordinate with neighboring vessels. None of that can be rushed under fire. The harbor imposed fixed arcs. Guns could not bear freely without risking friendly ships or shore structures. Anti-aircraft batteries had limited elevation and traverse due to cranes, warehouses, and masts nearby. Fire control calculations assumed clear water and separation. Here, every solution was constrained by geometry. Command structures reflected this reality. At anchor, readiness is tiered. Not every system is fully energized. Crews rotate through reduced watches. Ammunition is secured. This is not negligence. It is standard practice to preserve equipment and personnel. The assumption is simple. If danger approaches, there will be warning enough to escalate readiness. That assumption failed. The harbor's narrow approaches compressed the timeline. An engagement that would have unfolded over miles at sea arrived at the quays in moments. There was no buffer of distance to absorb surprise, no time to shift posture from rest to combat. Once the first shells landed, the harbor's order turned against its occupants. Smoke had nowhere to go. It pooled between hulls and stone, thickening rapidly. Fires reflected light in confined spaces, creating false bearings and blinding crews. Shockwaves ricocheted, loosening fittings and spreading damage beyond initial impacts. Mooring lines became restraints. Ships could not drift to create space. They could not align to present smaller profiles. They could not even separate burning from intact vessels. A fire on one deck threatened the next ship over within seconds. Coordination, normally a strength, became a liability. Any attempt to cast off risked collision. Any attempt to fire risked friendly damage. Orders conflicted with physical reality. The harbor dictated outcomes faster than command could adapt. This is the crucial point. The battle was not decided by superior seamanship or gunnery alone. It was decided by where the ships were when the first shots fell. Anchored, confined, and constrained, they were denied the basic options that make survival possible. At sea, ships can trade space for time. In harbor, space is fixed, and time collapses. By the moment crews understood this, the harbor had already done its work. It had turned safety into confinement, and confinement into loss. The first shots did not travel far. They did not arc across open water or announce themselves with distant thunder. They arrived almost immediately, crossing the short distance from attacker to harbor in seconds, not minutes. For the ships at anchor, there was no sense of approach, only impact. This was the defining difference. At sea, even a sudden engagement offers space. Shells take time to arrive. Crews hear the guns before they feel the hits. That delay, however brief, allows the mind to orient. In the harbor, that delay did not exist. The opening salvos landed at close range. Explosions tore into stationary hulls that had no speed to bleed shock, no angle to deflect blast. Steel plates buckled inward. Fires ignited immediately, fed by fuel lines and confined spaces. Damage that might have been survivable at sea became catastrophic at anchor. The harbor magnified everything. Shockwaves rebounded off stone walls and neighboring hulls. The sound was not directional, it came from everywhere at once. Crews struggled to tell which ship had been hit or from where the fire had come. Smoke rose fast and had nowhere to disperse, spreading laterally across the water instead of lifting away. Confusion followed impact instantly. Orders were shouted to raise steam, to cut lines, to bring guns online, but these commands collided with reality. Boilers cannot be rushed from cold. Mooring lines cannot be cast off cleanly while decks are burning. Guns cannot traverse freely when friendly ships sit meters away. The opening salvos decided this before anyone could respond. Several ships were struck in vital areas almost immediately: engine rooms, magazines, command spaces. The timing was ruthless. Damage occurred before systems meant to manage damage could even be activated. For crews, the sensation was not of being attacked. It was of being trapped. They were taking fire without movement, absorbing force without release. Every hit compounded the next, because nothing could be done to change position. The harbor fixed ships in place and forced them to endure. Attempts to answer back began unevenly. Some guns were brought to bear, firing cautiously through narrow arcs. Others remained silent, blocked by obstructions or friendly hulls. Fire control solutions were rushed, improvised, and often abandoned when smoke erased the target again. The attackers did not need prolonged accuracy. At this range, even near misses caused damage. Blast pressure shattered equipment, shrapnel raked decks. Fires spread ship to ship, carried by heat and debris rather than shells. Within moments, the engagement's character was clear. This was not a battle that would unfold. It would conclude. The harbor had removed distance, and with it, time. The opening salvos did not test defenses, they overwhelmed them by arriving where defenses could not function. By the time Italian crews fully understood what was happening, the critical damage had already been done. The battle was no longer about fighting back. It was about survival inside a space that offered none. What followed the opening salvos was not immediate collapse. It was paralysis. Anchored ships are built to fight while moving. Their systems assume motion, speed to create distance, turns to change angles, separation to prevent one hit from affecting another. In the harbor, none of that existed. Stillness, which normally meant safety, became a vulnerability that could not be escaped. The damage spread faster because nothing could move away from it. Fires that broke out on one ship radiated outward, heat rolling across narrow gaps to neighboring decks. Burning debris fell onto adjacent hulls. Smoke poured into confined spaces, reducing visibility to arm's length. Crews fought blazes they could not isolate, sealing compartments only to find heat building elsewhere. Command attempted to impose order. Orders to cast off were issued repeatedly. Mooring lines were cut in places, but ships drifted only inches before fouling one another. Some vessels began to turn under limited power, only to stop short when hulls threatened to collide. Every attempt to create space produced new danger. Gunnery remained constrained. Firing arcs were narrow and unsafe. Some guns could not elevate without risking friendly ships or shore structures. Others fired briefly, then ceased when smoke erased the target or blast endangered nearby crews. Counterfire existed in fragments, never as a coordinated response. The harbor amplified confusion. Sound echoed unpredictably, making it impossible to tell where hits were landing. Reports conflicted. One ship believed another had been struck. That ship believed the opposite. The command picture fractured into local emergencies with no unifying thread. This was the moment when the geometry of the harbor asserted itself fully. Ships that might have survived initial damage at sea now faced cascading failures. Fire control cables burned through, power dropped as generators overheated, pumps failed as smoke choked intakes. Damage control teams were forced to abandon sections entirely. The attackers did not need to press constantly. The environment was finishing the work. Each minute inside the harbor increased losses without requiring additional precision. Stillness kept ships exposed. Proximity spread damage. Confinement delayed recovery. By the time commanders recognized that the harbor itself had become the primary threat, the realization came too late to matter. The opening salvos had set conditions that could not be reversed. This was no longer a question of bravery or skill. It was a question of physics. Ships built to survive through movement had been trapped where movement was impossible. The harbor had removed choice, compressed time, and turned every mistake into a shared consequence. In 6 minutes, the outcome would be decided, not because the Italian warships failed to fight, but because the space around them had already chosen the result. The harbor had closed, and once it did, nothing inside it could get out. After the harbor closed, time stopped behaving normally. The first minute was shock. The second was confusion. After that, there was no sequence, only accumulation. Fires multiplied faster than they could be contained. Damage control teams were overwhelmed almost immediately, not because they lacked training, but because every ship was fighting a full-scale emergency at the same time. Hoses tangled, pumps failed, compartments filled with smoke before they could be sealed. In open water, a damaged ship can turn away, slow the spread, isolate the problem. In the harbor, damage had nowhere to go. Burning fuel drifted across the surface and lapped against neighboring hulls. Heat radiated sideways, igniting paint, cables, and exposed fittings on ships that had not yet been directly hit. What began as isolated fires became a single, shared inferno. Orders continued to be given. Cast off. Return fire. Create space. But these commands collided with physical limits. Boilers were not ready, lines were fouled, ships blocked one another's movement. Even successful attempts to break free ended in near collisions that forced engines back to idle. Guns fell silent one by one, not from lack of will, but from lack of conditions. Smoke obscured targets. Ammunition handling became dangerous as fires crept closer. Crews abandoned batteries not because they were ordered to, but because staying meant death. By the fourth minute, several ships were already beyond saving. By the fifth, survival had replaced resistance. By the sixth, the outcome was no longer in doubt. 7 Italian warships were lost not through prolonged combat, but through compression of space, of time, of options. The harbor did not allow the battle to unfold. It forced it to conclude. 6 minutes was all it took for stillness to become destruction. And once those minutes passed, nothing done afterward could change what had already been decided. The 7 ships did not all die the same way. Some were struck directly in vital spaces, engine rooms, magazines, command sections, where damage cascaded instantly. Fires ignited in enclosed compartments, pressure built, and crews were forced out before any meaningful control could be regained. These ships were effectively lost within minutes, even though they remained physically afloat for a short time afterward. Others succumbed more slowly. Flames spread along deck lines and down cable runs, cutting power and communication as they went. Pumps failed as smoke filled machinery spaces. Steering was irrelevant. The ships could not move anyway. What might have been survivable damage at sea became fatal when trapped against stone and steel. A few losses came indirectly. Ships not initially hit were caught by secondary fires. Burning debris fell across narrow gaps. Fuel on the water carried flames from one hull to another. Heat-weakened bulkheads never designed to face sustained external fire. These ships were consumed without ever being primary targets. This variety confused early assessments. From shore, it was difficult to tell which ships had been struck by enemy fire and which had been overwhelmed by the environment itself. The harbor blended causes together, making every loss feel simultaneous, even when it was not. What united all 7 was immobility. None could maneuver to reduce damage. None could separate from danger. Each ship was forced to endure whatever the harbor delivered to it. They did not fall as a formation. They fell as prisoners of their surroundings. And once the fires took hold, the distinction between direct attack and unavoidable consequence disappeared completely. For the sailors on board, the battle did not feel like combat. It felt like entrapment. Many crews never fired a shot. Their actions were consumed entirely by survival, carrying wounded, cutting through debris, trying to open passages warped by heat. Orders shifted quickly from resistance to evacuation, often without formal acknowledgement that the ship was lost. Abandoning ship inside a harbor is not simple. Lifeboats collided. Escape routes were blocked by fire or smoke. Men jumped into water already burning with fuel, swimming blindly toward docks they could not see. Shouts echoed off stone walls, making it impossible to tell where help was coming from. Officers faced impossible choices: stay and fight fires that could not be controlled, or order evacuation knowing that the harbor itself was burning. Many delayed the order too long, hopping for a turn that never came. There was no heroic charge. There was endurance. The defining memory for survivors was not gunfire, but heat, the relentless pressure of flame in spaces that could not be ventilated, the feeling that the ship was no longer a vessel, but a furnace. By the time crews reached shore or rescue craft, the outcome was already sealed. The harbor had taken the ships. All that remained was to save whoever could still be pulled from it. From a command perspective, the engagement unfolded faster than decisions could matter. There was no gradual escalation, no moment where alternatives could be weighed. The opening salvos created conditions that eliminated choice almost immediately. Orders issued after that point reacted to damage rather than shaping events. Commanders attempted to coordinate responses across the harbor. They called for firefighting support. They ordered ships to cast off where possible. They tried to prioritize which vessels might still be saved, but each decision ran into the same barrier: space. The harbor could not absorb simultaneous movement, fire, and evacuation. Any action taken to help one ship increased danger to another. Coordination became triage under impossible constraints. This is what made the loss feel sudden. The battle did not progress through phases, it jumped directly to consequence. By the time command understood that 7 ships were effectively doomed, those ships were already beyond intervention. There was no failure of leadership in the traditional sense. There was only the absence of options. The harbor had defined the battle before command could. When the fires finally began to subside, the harbor looked unfamiliar. Smoke lingered low over the water. Wreckage floated between quays. Blackened hulls sat half-submerged where ships had once rested neatly at anchor. The geometry that had once imposed order now framed destruction. Reports were slow and incomplete. Losses were counted visually before they were confirmed on paper. The timeline remained unclear. 6 minutes felt too short to explain what had happened, yet no other explanation fit. 7 ships were gone. Not scattered across the sea, but lost in place, within sight of shore, within reach of docks that could not save them. The realization was unsettling. The harbor had not been bypassed. It had been used. Its stillness, its confinement, its predictability had all been turned against the fleet inside it. This battle was not decided by maneuver. It was decided by absence of it. Warships are built to survive through movement, through distance, angle, and speed. In the harbor, all 3 were taken away. The opening salvos did not need to overpower defenses. They only needed to arrive where defense could not function. 7 Italian warships were lost in 6 minutes not because they were unprepared, but because they were fixed in place. The harbor promised safety. Instead, it removed escape. Once the first shells fell, everything else followed automatically. Fires spread, space vanished, time collapsed. Decisions came too late to matter. The lesson was brutal and simple. A harbor can protect ships from the sea. It cannot protect them from war. And when violence enters a confined space, stillness becomes as dangerous as any weapon. The harbor turned into a cage. And in 6 minutes, that cage decided the fate of everything inside it.